First of all, to our audience, thank you so much for joining us for our second event. The Roger Scruton Centre was set up earlier this year in August in memory of the great late Sir Roger Scruton. We are very, very proud to put on this second event entitled Nation Building and Political Stability in a Changing Middle East, Lebanon and Beyond. Of course, we couldn't do it without our two fantastic speakers, and we'd like to thank them both for their time tonight, and we'd like to thank you for joining us. The Roger Scruton Centre was founded to remember and to appreciate Sir Roger's contribution to philosophy and our understanding of the world, and to continue his work to help us become better students and understand what is going on in our world. Roger was very focused on the United Kingdom, but in 1987 he wrote a very short essay about Lebanon entitled A Land Held Hostage after visiting Lebanon. As he saw it, Western journalists in particular were not reporting accurately. There were misconceptions ranging from traditional Orientalism to general misunderstandings about what faction did what and what the impact of the bigger nations were on this small society which went through such upheaval and strife. Our two fantastic speakers tonight. So first and foremost, Ceren Kenar is a former journalist and commentator and TV host for TRT Haber and Haberturk. She's also written for the New York Times, Foreign Policy, The Daily Beast and Middle East Eye, as well as being attached to Turkey's former presidential press corps. Secondly of all, Ghena Hariri, who is an Ottoman historian, PhD candidate for Birkbeck, and before pursuing an academia and career, she was a successful businesswoman. The best place to start with a region like this is to ask about the history, to just get a basic understanding. Very often we can't go back decades, sometimes we need to go back centuries to understand the long historical continuities. My first question is going to be to Ghena, which is, what is the legacy of the Ottoman Empire's system of government, and what has its impact been on the institutions of its successor states, as well as their effectiveness when it comes to governance?
Thank you first for having me, and it's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. First, I would like to start with that Lebanon, we just celebrated the 100 years of the creation of Lebanon, and it's a country that has struggled to finding peace. We always had moments of a flux between stability and instability in the country, and it's a multi-sectarian society that had struggled with growing pains in forging both national identity and building estates. If we want to go back in history, just before the 100 years, we know that Lebanon has been historically part of the Ottoman Empire, after which dissolution and its loss in the First World War became part of the French mandate. We were under an empire, and then we were under a mandate before we got our independence in 1943. What was inherited, the most salient two factors that were inherited from the Ottoman Empire and that had a direct or an indirect effect for the past 100 years are two things. First of all, the power sharing mechanism or system that was established during the Mutasarrifiyya in the mid of the 19th century. The Mutasarrifiyya is the region of Mount Lebanon. In mid-19th century, after sectarian conflicts that erupted there, the Ottoman Empire, in addition to the different European powers, brokered an agreement between the local population, the two major sects of that region, the Maronites, Christian Maronites, and the Druze, in which they created a power-sharing system of Mutasarrifiyya, a semi-autonomous. It was one of the first semi-autonomous areas of the Ottoman Empire, and in which a local government or a local administration divided equally between Christians and Muslims or Druze, and headed by a Christian Ottoman civil servant. And it, as I said, it had some form of a form of autonomy. this system was created as power sharing, and it was created also to appease the majority, the popular majority vis-a-vis the ruler minority. So it was a form of support between both. The Mutasarrifiyya was creation of that was also adopted by the French during the Mandate, although it was adding peripheral rural areas that were added to it, which actually diluted the majority and created a new sectarian majority, but did not change the system in which the power sharing was established. And in 1920, Grand Liban was created before it became the Republic of Lebanon in the mid of the 20th century. So this is one aspect of what was inherited and affected the the state building apparatus in Lebanon over the years. It was also adopted by the French. The second aspect of the legacy is the millet system. The Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multinational empire. And in order to manage this diversity, the administration the central administration in Istanbul and the Sultan left the jurisdiction of managing the non-Muslim sects to their own religious establishments. And these religious establishments, the head of the religious establishment, represented that group of people vis-a-vis the Sultan and the court in Istanbul. That system, which actually managed the personal law and the civil code of the population, was and still is adopted in our days in Lebanon. What is the downside of that system? It's that whatever state is built in Lebanon, it has if I can say a defect, is that it does not serve equally all of its citizens. So it actually caters to the group and the community rather to the individual citizenry of its shareholders. And these are the two main factors and that affected the state building post-Ottoman Empire and post-French Mandate. It's very easy to actually fall for the founding myth of Lebanon in a sense that, and blame the failure or the dysfunction of the states in our days to the Ottoman Empire. But we have to keep in mind that the Ottoman Empire rule ended in 1918 with the end of the First World War. And after that, the French Mandate took over. And it's been more than 70 years now that we've had our independence. So evolution of the state should have happened all over, over that century, which to some extent did not. However, during times of stability in the past, I could say 70 years post-independence, we have periods where, like the Fuad Shahab period, like the post-war period during the time of Prime Minister Hariri, we have periods in which the central state was strengthened, where the public administration was developed, the public education system was extended, and the rural areas were connected to the center of the country. And these are times where we see that building the states had led to certain stability. However, these also were times where we had, it's post-Shahab time, where we had a rise in armed militia in the country that led to further destabilization and weakening of the state. So it's the weakening of the states is not just an inherit of the Ottoman Empire, but also of management and of the development of the state post-colonial and post-imperial times.
Following on from that, what sort of political ideas in the 20th century resulted in these states either becoming fragmented or becoming more stabilized, as Ghena's set out very eloquently here, as to the case of Lebanon? But then we could contrast that with somewhere like Turkey, which in its post-imperial phase actually became reasonably stable, united, was able to join NATO and have quite a prominent place, particularly not just in the region, but also in the European sphere as well.
Charlie, this is a very thoughtful question. I think we can list a couple of ideologies that proved to be very destructive in Middle East in 20th century. The first would be socialism. Socialism has been accompanied with Arab nationalism in Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, and socialist parties came to power through military coups. And Lebanon is neighboring totalitarian one-party state, a Ba'athist state, and for many reasons, Lebanon is cursed for its labor. Syria had been a very, very destructive power in Lebanon. And other ideologies that has been very destructive in the region can be listed as Islamic radicalism, sectarianism, and again, Lebanon suffered from all these radical movements. And in Scruton's words, Hezbollah was the child of Islamic fanaticism and Iranian intervention. These ideologies, along with ethnic nationalism, played a very destructive role in Middle East in 20th century. As Ghena has mentioned in her opening remarks, what is lacking in Lebanon and what exists in countries like Turkey and Israel in the region is the presence of a central state which can provide infrastructure and service to its citizens and a common national identity. So these two factors actually made Turkey and Israel different from their neighbors and relatively more stable in the Middle East. Another idea that we expect to enhance stability in the region is democracy. Sir Scruton would emphasize the democratic nature of Lebanon a lot in his writings. So unlike Jordan or, for example, Syria, Lebanon is a democratic country where there has been free and fair elections, free media. Of course, I mean, Hezbollah poses a significant threat to that democracy, but it is still a functioning democracy. Another factor, another idea that served to stability in the region would be monarchism, I would say, because Lebanon's, again, relatively stable period in history happened under Ottoman rule, and the monarchs in the region have proven to be immune to street protests such as Arab Spring. I mean, they were the ones who actually survived these protests. So I think this would be my summary and comparison between Turkey and Lebanon.
In regards to this idea of a strong central state, you have multiple regional leaders from Fattah al-Sisi to Abdullah of Jordan saying that fundamentally what matters more than anything else is this ability to govern and keep order. And therefore, there is enforced, particularly in the Western mind, this idea that ultimately it is about backing the strong, stable leader. And actually countries such as Lebanon, there is this democratic system where there is this more fragmented rule, and therefore it becomes a perpetuating cycle of negativity, particularly when it comes to Western foreign policy towards the region. Is this something that we should be challenging, or is this pursuit of a strong central government desirable?
Well, with regards to foreign policy in the region, I think the region was created under Sykes-Picot with an inherent room for intervention, foreign policy intervention. And we've seen it over the years. We've seen it in Lebanon, we've seen it lately in Iraq, but we've seen it in Lebanon, since the inception of Lebanon, because the whole protectorate system was a form of intervention. The central, a strong central state, as Ceren mentioned, that can provide infrastructure benefits and national identity, is very important in sense that it would protect the society from micro-interfering. Good example of that is the Iran-Hezbollah relationship, where the interference is not just, it's actually managing a whole group of the society in a weak state, which led to a rise in belligerency of the military militia of Hezbollah and in minute interference of the Iranian regime in the management of Hezbollah. It was not just armaments or financial aids or anything, but it's actual managing the whole policy. So if we look at a strong state in Lebanon would mean a state that would actually function and provide equally for all its citizens. A strong state in Lebanon is a state that actually would help create a national identity. And one more important issue here is actually to mitigate the fear of demographics in Lebanon. And this is one of the reasons why has been this continuous perpetuation of a power sharing system between the sects, because there's always this fear of demographic takeover. We have minorities, we have diversity, and we need to find a way to actually consider all ourselves or equal vis-a-vis the states. And the one way to actually achieve that is to have a strong state that would provide for its people, that it considers its people or equal among the law, in front of the law, especially the personal law. And with personal law, I mean the basic human law, like marriage, inheritance, divorces, child custody. These are not, this part of the law in Lebanon is it's not managed by the states, it's managed by communities. And so this creates an inherent inequality between the different sects and communities. The other factor is that you have an armed militia, and we have a history of violence in Lebanon, and this history of violence and the unarmed militia is always related to the failure of creating a national identity. We might have reached a stage where nowadays we have a national identity in a sense that all groups of all citizens and all communities consider themselves Lebanese, even though we might disagree or we find disagreement between communities about the ethos of that identity. So this is a step forward, but it's in order to actually implement a national identity, we do need a state that actually can provide for that. And this is what we failed to do.
We should also note, as I said, I mean, the lack of central states in Lebanon quite problematic, and Ghena elaborated more on that. But of course, what we understand from state power should also be discussed here, because in some countries in the region, too much central power was abused as well in history. And Turkey is also a good case for that, because the Turkish liberals and leftists has always been critical of the Turkish Kemalist establishment of exerting too much of state power. And there had been groups in Turkey defending, for example, a federation for Kurds. So here also in the region, there had been anti-democratic experiences with too much central state power as well.
Bringing this forward into the contemporary situation, a lot of observers have been picking up on the big regional power rivalry, and primarily in people's minds there is the Iranian-Saudi standoff there and the various alliances that are tied into that. What is driving these confrontations? Because this is Shia versus Sunni, or that this is about American hegemony in the region. But there seemed to be quite a complex set of alliances going on. And I was wondering if you could break down and explain a little bit more about the underlying forces driving these various conflicts.
I think ideology and strategic interests are driving these confrontations. On the one hand, we have Iran and proxies in the region as a main power hub, and Iran and its defenders, supporters, are standing for a very malicious, destructive ideology which thrives on stability and destruction. And we see Qatar and Turkey against Iran on certain fronts, and Qatar and Turkey is a relatively new alliance which emerged especially with Arab Spring, because these two countries perceived Arab Spring as an opportunity to overthrow authoritarian status quos in Arab countries, and they supported the mass protests against these regimes. And thirdly, we have United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, who are against both Iran and the Turkish-Qatari alliance. And here we also see that, of course, Emirates and Saudis, they want to expand their power, their influence in the region, and they promote a certain set of values. They see Muslim Brotherhood and these populist Islamist movements as an existential threat. So they perceive the Arab Spring as a counter-revolution, and they have been promoting a certain understanding of Islam in their own countries and trying to portray themselves as also moderate pro-Western actors in the West. So you must see that ideas play a very important role here, as well as strategic regional interests.
If I want to follow up on Ceren, is that the interference in the region and this axis that we've seen in the last few years, it's not new, because Ceren talks about the last 10 years or so since the Arab Spring, but that axis of interest and expansion and strategic alliances, or actually strategic expansions in the case of Iran, has been there for the past 40 years. And it's very interesting to see how each group actually interact with their alliances. Iran interferences, they strive on weakening the central state. They work more on military interventions through their proxies by having military armed clashes in different regions. We've seen that in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, and in Syria. And it's more of a divisive intervention.
This is a very interesting area, particularly when it comes to proxies and third parties. Very often we think it's a relationship that is built out of, official meetings and alliances, but sometimes it seems to go deeper. We have one of Qasem Soleimani's children, who was recently killed by President Trump in an assassination in Iraq, but one of Qasem Soleimani's daughters has married a top Hezbollah commander. And this is something that, traditionally is sort of outside of a lot of people's understanding of building alliances. This goes to almost a deeper level when you have almost familial relations between these various actors. And it seems power and relationships are also built along personal relationships and family.
I think it goes deeper than this. If we go to take the example of Iranian interferences, it goes much deeper than actually fighting proxy. Or it has a social aspect to this intervention. It promotes a certain strand of Islam, and Shia Islam in particular, that is opposed, historically has been opposed to Arab Shia Islam. And with the rise of the Khomeini and the regime in Iran, they were exporting not just their strategic interests and harboring their own people, but also exporting their strand of Shia Islam that is to a certain extent up until the creation of Hezbollah and all the other groups haven't been accepted locally, or not accepted, but it's foreign, it's alien to the local population and in their own communities. And this is why you see that such alliance that you consider medieval it's more of emphasizing a certain level of allegiance by having familiar connections.
In specific regards to Lebanon, you touched upon this a tiny bit earlier. If you could go into a bit more detail about the processes and reforms that you think need to take place to restore political stability, and which institutions within Lebanon do you think provide a model for potential cross-confessional cooperation?
Lebanon nowadays going through a lot. It's going through an economic meltdown. It's also going through political upheaval and standstill. Anybody now remembers any similar situation in Lebanon, even during the civil war, that has reached to this. I'm not going to talk about the economics. Economy is not my forte, but maybe I'll discuss a bit of the political process and what could actually be some steps taken in order to mitigate this standstill that we've reached. Lebanon has historically been built on three components. So you had the political establishment, including the state, you had the business, the private sector, and you had the civil society. And we've always had a very strong and active civil society for many reasons, but also one of those is the weakened central state. Any reform or any step further that would take us out of this quagmire that we're in, I believe should be within a national dialogue between all components of Lebanon, which includes the political establishment, the private sector, and the civil society. And due to the history, the violent history of Lebanon, any toppling of the regime, I'm afraid that such steps might lead to really violent results that no one wants to reach. Therefore, dialogue is the number one aspect. The dialogue between the private sector and the political establishment is going on. However, it's not to my knowledge that the dialogue is going on between the civil society that represent the protesters nowadays and the other two components, mainly for reasons of refusal to take such step, or for the problem is that there is a lack of organization within that group in order to come up with a representative. It's very important that the youth of Lebanon, that the civil society in Lebanon be able to actually organize itself into political entities, because changes will come from within, and people who wants a change and reform need to be part of a system. The Lebanon is a parliamentarian state. All laws and regulations go through the parliament. All reforms have to be ratified within the parliament. As much as our elections might have some hiccup, these are democratic elections, and therefore the parliament is one of the institutions that should lead the reform. And in order to do that, people should organize themselves and really organize themselves in order to have a proper representation. No one can deny that there's issues with the system nowadays. The power sharing system was renegotiated during the TAIF agreement, in which now it's a more consensus based, in a sense that it's unlike previous to 1989. The president is not the last resort for any decision making, but decision making process is done in the cabinet through unified consensus. The other issue that could actually help with the reform is the personal law, is actually having a personal law where everybody is equal, or at least having a personal civic code that's set up by the state that actually have people become equals vis-a-vis the states, but have the upper hand within the choice if you want to go to, if you want to elect to actually follow your sects or your religious code, or whether you want to cut the state code. This also brings some form of unity. The TAIF agreement has divided the parliament into two chambers. The first is the Senate, which is based on a sectarian distribution, and the second is the parliament, which would be elected on non-sectarian basis. And the reason why the sectarian Senate was created is in order to actually address the demographic fears of minority versus majority and the numbers and all of that. Because in the agreement of the TAIF, if we follow the reforms, we see that actually they stopped doing census. To a certain extent, this might not be statistically viable, but it's more important. It was done more importantly in order to mitigate fear of being differentialized and sidelined.
How should Western powers in particular, those who have a history of either supporting Lebanon or who have very good relations with Lebanon, support the various groups that are seeking to restore political stability?
I think the main important thing for the Biden administration is not to repeat the mistakes of the Obama administration in Lebanon and Syria. The Obama administration has a very, very dark legacy in the Middle East. It has a shameful record on Syria, and in Iran has been emboldened in the region due to the deal reached out between Obama and the Iranian government. The most important contributions that the Trump administration did in the region was curtailing that Iranian expansion and power. Iranian intervention to Lebanon should be limited through leaving Hezbollah out of any negotiation. The other irony about Lebanon is, on the one hand, the Lebanese people, rightly so, want to change the system. They want to change those who are ruling them. But also, it is the Lebanese people who are voting for this, because as we mentioned in this panel before, again and again, Lebanon is a democracy. It is a function, the elections are free and fair. And in fact, Macron, when he was visiting Beirut this summer, protesters wanted Macron not to collaborate with the current politicians, with the current leaders of Lebanon. And he responded saying, but you elected them. So there is this kind of a prisoner's dilemma when it comes to the Lebanese system. On the one hand, it's a democracy, but people are not satisfied with the people who they have been electing. And on the other hand, the sectarian divisions in Lebanon prevents each and every sect to make sacrifices and go beyond their sectarian interests. That's the most important thing, I think, is to seeing the elephant in the room, which is Hezbollah, and not providing Hezbollah any legitimacy.
Our first question comes from Ghena Hariri. Does the recent catastrophe in Beirut strengthen the voice for the free civil society? And I think what Ghena means is the recent terrible explosion that happened in Beirut.
The recent catastrophe in Beirut has actually proven how active and dynamic the civil society in Lebanon, how they can organize themselves and how they can manage to help each other to get out of such disturbing event. But on the other hand, it also proves how much the society in Lebanon can manage without a state. It's on one hand, it's a positive thing. On the other hand, it's really a very detrimental thing to the development of the state when you have a civil society that actually can manage without the interfering of a state and on such a grand level as, you know, post Beirut explosion. Their voice would be strengthened if they can manage to organize themselves beyond their sectarian and geographical differences. Once this has happened, they might be able to have more way into their demands and having a foot in the door, let's say, in the areas where they can manage their reform and they can impose reforms that they wanted, especially the youth. We have a young generation that's been to the streets both before the explosion and after the explosion. This is a generation that did not live through the war. And this is a generation who actually have seen the deterioration in the services that the state would provide and the gridlock that we've reached on the political level. And they are angry and they want change. And they could have change if they managed to, again, organize themselves.
With regards to getting a kind of cross-confessional, non-sectarian or non-religiously based movement, does the current party coalition in Lebanon, in the Lebanese parliament, offer some kind of solution to this? Because our understanding usually of Lebanese politics is very much that of there is certain blocks, but actually it's much more complicated than that, that there are different parties from the various different confessional groups will form a government and choose, for example, to form governments based more upon ideas or alliances, as opposed to simply the two Sunni parties going together, the Arab Nationalist Party siding simply with other secularists. So does the current coalition offer any opportunities to move forward?
If you want to talk about the parties, that's one of the aspects that actually does need a lot of reform in Lebanon is the party law. It's a law that has been established in 1908 during the Ittihad al-Taraqi Progress and Union government of the last government of the Ottoman Empire. And it hasn't changed much since then. And this is where it needed to be changed. The current law actually allows for parties to be more or less sectarian, even though in the structure it might not, but it does allow, because this is a law that organizes associations and not political parties. And so political parties grow from associations, and it's a bit complicated. It does give room for the establishment of cross-sectarian, cross-geographic political parties, but it also allows sectarian and regional parties to be there. But we have to understand that we can talk about reforms and institutions and parties and civil society, but we have an elephant in the room, and we have a militia. And when you have a militia, a political party with a heavily armed sector within it kind of like has the upper hand in managing a lot of things that's going on.
And actually, this ties into another question from Arbe Jaeger, which is, surely the non-state actors, and by this I think he means the militias, are ultimately going to ruin any attempt at cross-communal parties or associations bringing about that change. So what steps possibly could be taken? Is it a case of paying off the militias potentially, or getting some kind of conference whereby their various backers come to the table and are persuaded? Are there any sort of specifics, or is this effectively too complicated at this stage to de-arm them?
It is complicated, and one should actually approach it without any emotional baggage, because we've had a history in Lebanon of having a militia, an armed militia, stronger than the states. It was during the PLO times, and in 1982 we put them on a boat and sent them off into the Mediterranean. But this cannot happen with Hezbollah at the moment, because whether we like it or not, whether we oppose or not, whatever our position, the constituents of Hezbollah are Lebanese, and these are people that share this country with us. And these are people that elect their representative. I think last elections, around 200,000 people voted for Hezbollah. And that makes us, we need to actually discuss this non-state actor and its belligerency and military intervention that actually went beyond the borders of Lebanon, in actually having a national dialogue about the priorities of the state of Lebanon, of having a state like Lebanon. What are our priorities? What do we need to do? How do we identify ourselves? How do we present ourselves? What we need to work on first? This is a discussion that should happen on a national level, not just on a political level, but also on a civil society level, on a communal level, because these people who support the different fractions and the different political parties and the different sectarian or non-sectarian political parties, these are people who actually are Lebanese and live within the communities, and they have, maybe their neighbors might be different from them or having a different opinion. And we should have some form of a dialogue on a grassroots level in order to come up with a way to demilitarize Hezbollah. And having that just was probably like the IRA in Ireland. It's almost a similar case.
That's a very interesting comparison. A final question. You're in a room with newly elected Joseph Biden, and he is offering a new policy, a new support package, or some particular gift that the United States can bestow with its tremendous power to help you. What particular thing would you ask newly elected Joe Biden to give you to help solve the immediate problems in Lebanon, if you had your ultimate wish?
Well, that's a tricky question. I think economically, Lebanon is facing a meltdown. So firstly, a very, very significant economic aid is needed in the country, because here we're talking about the possibility of even a famine, and people, the middle classes in Lebanon, which made this country so vivid and such a strong and rich social capital, has been facing really difficult economic hardships right now. The middle classes are almost evaporated. So this, I think, an economic aid package is a priority. But again, the question is through which channels this aid package will be delivered to Lebanon, because current politicians have been proven again and again to be very incompetent and corrupt. And therefore, the Lebanese people have been telling all the Western leaders that these aids should be given to Lebanese people, not to Lebanese politicians. So I think that would be the main thing that I would ask from Biden.
I agree with Ceren that the economic situation is the priority now. We need to actually stop the decline or the meltdown that we're going through. And there are so many programs that have been approved actually by international donors that they need revision with this, according to the current circumstances. And this is what we need to help, is just revision and implement the reforms that are included in these programs, and then take it from there. And I think once the political, if you can say, the political quagmire that we're in would eventually naturally evolve into a solution, get a solution once the economic situation is stabilized and it's stabilized in the country.
Final question comes from Serenity. Do you believe that young people will be able to influence the government towards adopting these reforms and these initiatives which you have both recommended in your comments?
The youth in Lebanon, of course, was a major driving force during last year's protests. And we must keep in mind that there had been daily protests for almost a year, and Lebanese youth were pioneering these protests, and they were out on the streets demanding change. But how will the Lebanese politicians and the ruling elite will hear these demands? I'm not very optimistic, I must say. So it's a kind of, as I said, a vicious cycle that Lebanon finds itself in.
I think they could be, I mean, through dialogue you can influence and actually put a list of demands that could be looked at and could be negotiated. And I think this is the most peaceful and effective way to do it, is actually to demand dialogue and to demand to be heard, in order to actually have some form of influence and reach, if not by being elected into, but at least reach by negotiating reforms within the political institutions of the country.
Thank you. I think we've come to the end of our talk, and I want to thank our two fantastic speakers once again. Ghena Hariri, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Ceren Kenar, thank you so much. You can follow both these fantastic ladies on Twitter, and I highly recommend you do. And please follow their work, as well as the Roger Scruton Centre and our upcoming events. Our next event is on the 26th of November. We will be speaking to former number 10 advisor Nick Timothy, and we look forward to seeing you there. Good night and all the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the audience and the great questions.